Where am I? It's 2018, Tokyo, Japan. It seems like the life that I had before, the life that I grew up with in New Zealand, it feels like something that I read in a book, if that makes sense. It feels like I'm reading the story of someone else when I think back to those old days. There's this time when all I knew was the town that I grew up in. The big cities, even the cities in New Zealand, which very occasionally I had the opportunity to visit, they still seemed like these faraway metropolises that were beyond imagination for many years. I mean, traveling to somewhere like Wellington, a relatively small city by global standards, was an ordeal. It was a trip. It was a big thing. And that was where I spent my childhood, is in an environment where the city was the other. My understanding of urban systems, of the way people can live together and function in this machine that we call the city, which perhaps arguably is the greatest invention of all time, this ability for humans to collaborate and cohabitate in the same area, which brings innovation, technology, and all of these other things to fruition. And I spent a long time away from that on the antithesis, which is in the countryside, in a small town in New Zealand where not much of anything happened. And I remember always having this longing and this admiration for the city. And in Japanese we would say akogare. I had akogare for the city, and I explored that through media, through film, video games, books as well. But primarily it was growing up. I grew up on the edge of the internet was relatively established, but it was still emerging, and so I had this opportunity to use the internet and to use video games and to use other technology to begin to explore beyond the bounds of the town that I grew up in. And that, for me, was my entry into understanding the metaphysical aspect of the city. Okay, so I never explored the city physically until I was much older. My understanding of it was always mediated through the computer or through the television, but I would say more so the computer. I spent a lot of time, as many people do, I spent a lot of time by myself in my room on my computer. I was really into creating with the limited skill and means that I had. I remember just being so hungry for any chance to create or to code or to animate or to do anything with the computer. I remember in intermediate school, junior high school, I guess I was 12 years old, 11 years old, and we were able to use the computer room at lunchtimes. We had this kind of this setup. We were kind of in with the teacher, my homeroom teacher actually, Mr. Stove, and he sort of saw that there was a bunch of us, mainly boys, and we were really into creating animation, websites, and basically just messing around on the computers. And we had computer class, technology class, but it wasn't quite enough for all of us. And I remember we used to go there at lunchtimes, and we would spend all lunch in this darkened computer lab, just messing around with Flash or Front Page or whatever it was. And there wasn't much we knew. We were still basically noobs at the end of the day. And I remember we used to use PowerPoint for creating animations, because if you run a PowerPoint without any delay on the slides, it basically does, as fast as the computer can go, it will run those slides like like a cartoon. And so if you move the objects a little by little on each slide, it will actually start animating it. And you'd end up with these PowerPoints that were like 2,000 slides long, and you just press play and it would start looping through, and you could make an animation. And that was like that was our thing, because none of the computers had anything else on them except Microsoft Office, and it wasn't like that we could install software or anything like that. And that was, for me, that was defined kind of what it was like for me at junior high school. I was really into creating stuff, and I remember whenever I got the opportunity to get my hands on an old computer or an old camera or anything, I would firstly take it apart, and then I would start messing around with it. And there was this curiosity and this longing for understanding and for knowledge, and all of that was mediated through the technology, and this I guess this artistic sense of what was out there. There was something beyond the realms of this town that we were in, but our ability to comprehend it was still emerging. We didn't have. I don't think anyone at that age can claim to have any kind of knowledge of the world, but we were still aware that there was something out there, but we weren't able, because of our age and because of where we weren't able to actually leave our situation. And so it leads to this kind of longing and dreaming, and these moments of creativity that, looking back, were quite seminal to where I am today. There was a lot of video games that I really got into when I was at that age, and it's funny because just recently I've gone through. I haven't played video games in any capacity for, I would say, 10 years, maybe 8 years. But really, since I left high school, it basically dropped off my to-do list. I used to be really quite into it, and I was really into single-player campaigns and deep storylines and games that would give me an insight, a glimpse at a world that I was unable to see with my own eyes. And so the game I think that really changed my life at that point was Half-Life 2. I remember playing it when it came out in 2004. It might have been, when I got around to playing it, it might have actually been 2005, because I had to play it on a friend's computer because I didn't have a good computer at the time. And I was still a kid as well. I remember my friend, he had his older brother had a gaming computer that was like the beast. And this was back in the day. And I remember, we had to kind of make sure we would jump on the computer when his brother was out, or when his brother was at work, because that was the only opportunity we got to play. And that was, you get Half-Life 2 on the CD, and that they tried to get you to install it through Steam as well, I think. But I remember just looking at the box art and really getting engorged and involved with this this new idea that there was this world created in this game that, for me, was absolutely phenomenal. And the graphics at the time, the physics, the gameplay, the storyline, everything was so deep and fresh, and basically it was amazing. It blew me away, especially for considering again that I didn't know any better. This was amazing stuff. And I remember we really got into that. Me and my friends, we really got into the idea of the game. And of course, the first thing that we did was we played the game, and then we started getting into modding and modifying the game and building our own maps and our own worlds, right? It was very good at the time, this Half-Life 2. You were able to download the source development kit, which allowed you to actually create maps and basically reuse the resources of the game to refashion levels and and kind of create your own thing. And that was basically the gateway to what I really wanted to do, which was creating these worlds. And so we had all of these ideas, these crazy ideas. It's funny, because we were just kids, we were, 15, 16 years old. I remember we would sit lying down on the floor in this darkened room, no matter what the weather was like outside, no matter what was going on outside, we would sit down and we would just have these huge discussions and um, these talks about what the worlds that we were going to create, and the game companies we were going to start, and the stories we were going to tell. And it was these huge dialectic things with my friend. And we eventually, I started getting into 3D modeling, and I had always been interested in, playing around with Photoshop and other creative software. And somehow or other, we were able to get our hands on this different software and these different, we were able to get new computers, or, we never had a new computer. If I think back, we always were using second-hand computers that we had built ourselves from parts that we had scavenged. But we got better parts, we got better graphics cards, we got more memory, so that we could do more stuff. And there was this period there, I guess through high school, where I really got into creating these worlds. I really got into 3D modeling, 3D Studio Max, XSI, and some of the other software that was, at the time it was still, early on. I think ZBrush was still in its earlier release. There wasn't that much to creating a 3D model and throwing it in a game, And I remember we did that. You could create objects for the Half-Life 2 engine, the Source engine, and you could throw it into a map, and it's like, wow, there's this thing that I modeled in 3D. I textured it in Photoshop myself, and then I was able to get it into a level, and I was able to, put a physics box on it and shoot it around and pick it up with the gravity gun, and it was like, wow, I've conceptualized this virtual world. I've created something inside the machine, and that feeling, that ability to create and to bring life to an artistic concept was so powerful for me at the time. I didn't really even know what to do. It was just like, this is it. This is the only thing I can do. And I kind of continued along that journey for several years. I eventually found myself in Wellington, the bigger city, and I was still very interested in this idea of these worlds that existed within the machine, these conceptual worlds, that somehow our reality that we're in now, the real world, was somehow just a staging zone for creating these other artistic spaces, and I guess I just really didn't understand what was going on anyway. I was basically a geek, and I was into making these worlds, and I did a lot of Photoshop. I was playing around with concept art, and again, it was fully self-taught. I didn't have any exposure to the commercial side of things. I couldn't even really begin to even understand it at that stage, I don't think. I was working part-time, just at a local shop, selling computers and computer furniture and things like that. And I also supplemented my income by doing the occasional website, or creating a WordPress website for somebody. But again, at that stage, I was still basically a noob. I still am, I think, in many ways. But I was trying to create something without much of a theoretical background. I was unsure really of the bigger picture, and I think I had basically emerged from this big sleep of being unknown, of not knowing much of anything, to suddenly having this ability to create these worlds. And of course, what you do is you fall back on cliche. You fall back on what we had seen, and trying to reproduce that with the limited skill we had, basically creating knockoffs. And so I remember back these worlds we used to create, my friends and I, we would ultimately, we would be copying what Half-Life 2 had done so elegantly as well. The seamless experience of the game compared to these zombie shoot-up maps that we would make, that somehow we would tell ourselves that these were these amazing zombie stories, survival stories. And I remember we'd walk around the streets of my hometown and we'd be like, yeah, look, we could make this into a map. We could make this into a level. This is where we hold out from the zombie hordes. And basically it was copying the popular media of the time. There was a lot of films of that nature that came out, and looking back, it was so narrow-minded and closed off. But again, it was pure. It was a pure kind of creativity. We were ignorant, and we didn't know what we didn't know. And it was only much later that I began to undertake this process, and I think it began when I was in Japan, when I first came to Japan at least. I began this process of really reading and watching films deeply. So reading literature and watching films, and drilling down into the artistic, social, cultural history of those works. Apolitically, of course, I'm always interested in the artistic side of it, but what led to that work? What inspired it? What is the storyline? What is the ancestry of this piece of work? And you go back and you start reading these stories, and it's like, wow, there is a world that's not fictional. There's a lot of these works. It's based on the author's experiences in the real world. And even though the characters and the settings may be fictionalized, they're writing from a place bound in reality. Okay, the stories that I first really got into, the first books I really read deeply, I would say it wasn't until I came to Japan that I was able to pick up a book and really get into it. And that was, reading Japanese literature. Until then, of course you read books, you read stories in high school. You study books. How many times did we go through To Kill a Mockingbird or New Zealand short story authors? There's all these stories that we read, but I never really was able to understand that it was created in response to reality. Okay, of course there's pure fantasy. And that's a whole other category, and that's something that I've never been able to get into. I think maybe when I was a child I read Harry Potter once, the first or second books, but that was about it. After that, I was never really able to get into this purely fantastic world that those kind of books deal with, because it was incompatible with reality. Something like Half-Life 2, which in a sense it's science fiction, it's fantasy as well, but the themes and the philosophies and the visual look, the story, everything about it is based on reality, and thoughts on reality, and concepts of dystopia, utopia, these kind of ideas that developed science fiction as science and fiction. And so there just felt like there was more reality to those stories than fantastic escapism of dragons and magic and things like that, which felt like a cop-out, if that makes sense. I just was never really able to get into that, because it's a totally incompatible world with reality. Whereas these stories and these worlds that I was getting into, they felt like they had a connection with reality, and there was some kind of edge to it. I always felt like the fantastic side of it was an escapism. It wasn't able to answer the questions that I was beginning to have, because magic solves everything, and there's these quite basic concepts that seem to underline that world, loyalty to your friends, or magic and sorcery and all of these things, and it just didn't seem to have a basis in reality that I could understand. And of course, loyalty, love, that these things are important, but why are they important, and how did they emerge? Where did they come from? And what can they lead to? These are the kind of questions I began to have. These humanist kind of questions. And so, I slowly got into reading more, and I started developing this habit, which I remember always, I think New Zealand is a very, it's a country with very little literature, and not for negative reasons. It's simply a very practical place, and so of course historically there are some authors who you can still pick up their work, and you can read Catherine Mansfield, but that's from a New Zealand that we're totally disconnected from. That's the early Dominion, the colonial period of New Zealand is something that people are completely unaware of. I think in many cases, I think it's something you need to read non-fiction to really get an idea of what really happened back then, because just the way modernity has evolved, we're very disconnected from that. But needless to say, the idea of literature and of reading and of conceptualizing and the literary tradition was something that unfortunately I was not really exposed to. And as I said before, I think that I was living in this kind of bubble, small town New Zealand, where simply those things didn't emerge. And of course we had libraries, and I remember I read, I used the school library quite liberally to find different things and to explore, but it was very much self-directed. There was very little structure to it. I had to seek it out myself, and I think that's probably the way it works in most cases anyway. If you're forced to read something, you're probably not going to appreciate it in the same way. But again, it wasn't until I came to Japan that I really began to understand that there is a global literary tradition that each country kind of contributes to, and especially in the Western tradition, going back all the way to the time of the ancient Greeks and Romans, there's all of this literature that answers the questions that we have, and that, or at least begins to talk about it. There's a discourse there, and it began to open my mind up, because it's like these guys are talking about stories and things and concepts that even today are still relevant. And the way they talk about it, it's like, wow, actually I can kind of put myself in their shoes. I can go back and I can travel. It's a time machine. I can travel back to that period in time, whether it's fiction or non-fiction, allegoric or poetic, whatever it is. It's got a piece of the reality that the author was part of, and especially if you're reading it in its original form, its original language, if possible, you're reading the words that author put down, and it's giving you a gateway, a portal into this reality that once was. And that's where these ideas for what I've been doing with my photography and with, I guess more conceptually, that's where I've been slowly moving towards, is this idea that time and place, there are these two axes. You have the time, whether it's today, 2018, or whether it's 300 years ago. There's a time, and then there's a place, and you're standing there, and those axes, the time is constantly in motion, but you can kind of, with the portal of literature, of the aesthetic history of images, you can go back and forth and explore these times. You can kind of jump between them, and especially today in this era when we have so much technology available to us, the internet and other media, and things that are still to come. I think with VR and other emerging technology, we're going to have so much more opportunity to go back and explore these historical ideas and these historical places. and that's something that I'm very interested in. And I think going back to this idea of world making that I had, growing up and spending time on my computer trying to create stuff, today I feel quite different about it. And recently, actually, I managed to get Half-Life 2 on working on my computer. Here we are, 14 years on from the original, when it came out. And I played through episode 1 and episode 2 and the original Half-Life 2, and I looked at it and I thought, wow, this is the same world that I'm playing through. It's a virtual world, a virtual storyline, but I'm playing it again 14 years later. And how have I changed? How has the barometer of the game, which is unchanging, graphically it's the same, the storyline is the same. It's an unchanging constant. That's what it is. But what I am is I've gone on this whole journey of my own. I've travelled. I have pushed personal boundaries, conceptual boundaries. I've really tried at every step to approach the world with a kind of rational, logical approach that to help me understand it. You need to have some sort of rational system, and then of course on top of that there's an artistic, an aesthetic understanding that goes along with that. And so the game, it's there. The world of Half-Life 2 and City 17 is still there, and I'm coming back and I'm looking at it as a different man. And as the old saying goes, you can never step into the same river twice, because the river won't be the same, and neither will you. And I feel like that's what's happened there. I played through, and play is such a funny verb. I feel like it's it's an experience. I was able to virtually walk through this dystopian future vision of this world, and I played it. I went and experienced it at this influential time in my life when I was going through, obviously adolescence, and my creative faculties were emerging, and I played it at that time, and now I'm coming back and I'm revisiting it, and I'm looking at it again after all that I've seen in those 14, 15 years. And it feels, it's ridiculous to say that, 15 years. It just, yeah, I can feel it, but then I also say, it's like I'm looking at someone else's life, 15 years ago. I can't even really begin to even imagine that. It was me doing that, but it feels like I'm reading someone else's biography when I remember back. And anyway, I went through this world, and I experienced the world of Half-Life 2, and I think, wow, this is cool, but I definitely see the limitations. I definitely see the artistic decisions, the technical limitations of the game itself, and I can see that there was more now that I can see clearly, because before when I experienced it, it represented everything that I had kind of been dreaming about, of what the rest of the world might be like, what a potential sci-fi future might be. There was all these kind of things that went into it to give it meaning. And now, as I've grown and hopefully have matured, I can look at it and see, well, maybe it was a good game for its time, but I've got more now, more experience, more understanding, I hope, of the world, and so I can see its limitations. And for me, that was at the same time a bittersweet discovery to feel this, to know that, well, actually, I can't go back. I can't go back to taking it at face value and holding it up and saying, this is it, this is the pinnacle, because I know that that's not the case. I have to now seek out more and I have to go deeper because I know that there is still very powerful work out there in a range of media, but you have to look for it, and you have to go deep, and you have to engage with it. And the other big discovery, I think, the other big side of this discussion, I think, is the idea that I am living this life that I had longed for a while now. I think I've been living it, and so the world that I was dreaming of and I was experiencing through media when I was playing these games and watching these movies and doing all of this stuff when I was a kid. Now, I go out and I sometimes think, wow, the stuff that I'm doing, sometimes on a daily basis, is phenomenal, and I don't think I could even begin to explain it to myself. If somehow, you could have that discussion with yourself about, if you could slip a word to your 15-year-old self, I think you would have, a hard time really even convincing him that it was that you're not lying, or that could he even begin to understand what it is that I'm doing? And that, I think, itself is a major discovery and something that's quite important, because just recently my travels through Taiwan and through China, Shanghai, my life here in Tokyo, I am in a sense living the life that I didn't even know that I wanted, but that I was kind of dreaming of back in New Zealand when I was a child. And that's really powerful, this idea that I had this kind of subliminal direction of where I wanted to go, and somehow or other I arrived there. And so, just last month, the other month, I was in Shanghai, and obviously Tokyo is an incredible, amazing place, and I've had some incredible experiences here as well, but Shanghai, that was a whole nother level. I flew in, and I was only there for 4 days on a transit visa, which was a whole nother story. But I saw things in those 4 days that changed my life. That city there's an incredible amount going on there, and it's, architecturally, visually, culturally, there's all of this input that was super fresh, and add that together with a little bit of anxiety on my behalf, I was basically blown away, and I had this aesthetic epiphany, and this stuff started emerging out of me that I was no longer taking existing media or existing products and basically doing a bad copy of it like I had done when I was younger. I was generating, based on my environment, I was generating real ideas, real thoughts, real visuals that I'm still kind of processing even today. I'm still kind of working through what happened in Shanghai, to be honest. But I had these moments that I felt I was in this kind of flow state, and I started writing, I was taking photographs, I was exploring, I was living this moment. My life had become basically the game that I had used to play. I remember I was out there, I got a bicycle and I was cruising around late at night, the streets of Shanghai. There was a light rain, a light mist. I had my camera and my tripod and all my gear, and I was exploring these back streets, this old colonial architecture, the mist of the city hanging over, with this red glow, this ominous red glow across the Bund, the glass skyscrapers, the steel, stretching up past the fog, past the mist, into the sky, illuminated with this red, this distinctive red of Shanghai, of China. And I remember looking at that moment and being in awe of what I saw before me with my own eyes. And whereas as a child I had been in awe of what I saw on the screen, what I now experienced was a direct reality. And that, I think, is what I had always been searching for in a sense. And I didn't get it when I was when I was in New Zealand. It was a different kind of reality. It was a very bucolic, down to earth reality where we were climbing mountains or fishing. Very beautiful moments in their own. And I think something that has deeply inspired me. But urban reality, the science fiction future, the idea of Derive, this series that I've created, Derive, to wander, to experience the city, to experience reality in a new way, to see the past and the future at the same time. This is what I had always been looking for, I think, and I just didn't know it. And so now, I've started recently going back and revisiting some of these processes that I had when I was younger, that were very, they were uncodified processes. They were simply things that I did, things like playing video games or browsing websites like everything2.com, which has a lot of poetry and writing and very internet 1.0 style dialogue. People use these nicknames, and they would write just random stories about the early 2000s. Random. It's kind of like a cross between Wikipedia and Reddit, and without any of the kind of the raw reality that you get with those, which is the political situation and all this different stuff going on in the world. And the earlier internet kind of felt like it had a little bit more utopianism to it, and websites like Everything Too have this. That they still have that, and they haven't changed. They've still got original posts from the early 2000s, and you can read through it, and it was this this kind of innocence to it that I had, I think, at that time as well, which was why I got into that. The original kind of surfing the internet before social media was a thing. You either had direct messages with people, email or MSN Messenger, or you just read random stuff, and you would just kind of surf from place to place. You would find tutorials for this or that. You'd read someone's history on a topic, and it felt like it was more encyclopedic than it is today. Which, today everything seems to be social and connected, and you're putting it out there for people to see, whereas back in the day you had nicknames and handles, and it was kind of hidden behind a little bit of anonymity. And I think that's something that I look back on, and I'm trying to pick up what it was that I had back then. That's why I wanted to play through Half-Life 2 again. I wanted to address some of these media that I had consumed back in the day. And I think it's an interesting process to go through, to revisit things that inspired you, and to pick them apart and to look at them, at least critically, if not aesthetically, and think, well, what was it that I took from this back then, and what can I take from it today? How have I changed? And I've started messing around with 3D software again, something, I basically took a 10-year break from that. I mean, I was never professional in any sense of it. I was always just messing around. But today it's like you look at what's possible with 3D, with motion graphics, with things like Houdini and Cinema 4D, and some of the quality, the photorealistic quality that's now possible, which was always possible, but it took a lot more work, and again, our understanding of what was photorealistic has changed and evolved, and so now there's this movement towards absolute photorealism, which has changed the nature of creating with 3D, and it's become almost like we have to document. We're this kind of scientists, and we're documenting reality. We're recreating reality in the machine. Whereas before, it felt a little bit more playful. We're not trying to recreate reality. This is good enough. And even at the time, it felt like it was pretty damn good. But looking back, it's like, wow, yeah, there was a lot of room for it to evolve. But now, I'm beginning to feel like things are getting more and more constrained by well, how realistic is this? How good is the shading on this? And there's a move away from the storytelling aspect of it, or the conceptual nature, going back to these PowerPoint animations that I used to make. It was like they were literally just shapes in the PowerPoint that you press play and they start moving around the screen. But that was, for me, I could put all of my creative energy into that, and I could take something from it. I could put myself into that, and I created characters. I remember we created these little worlds, and now it feels like there's so much. There's this drive, this blinded drive towards photorealism, and also the other side of that is with Instagram, especially. There's everyone's looking at what everyone else is doing and consuming it bit by bit, and so especially I think in the motion graphics 3D industry, which is something I'm only tangentially sort of watching it from the outside, but I look at it and it's like everyone's starting to create the same kind of thing. Everyone's starting to create the same kind of material, and once people who are quite quite high up in the industry, people who are respected, who have got a history of creating good stuff, once they do something, then it instantly gets picked up by everyone else, and then people start creating tutorials on recreating this style and recreating this thing, and there's this kind of this desire to recreate and to kind of basically copycat. And of course that's how people learn, that's how things develop. But I feel like there was something there when the internet was a little bit more, when it was 1.0 and people were still kind of in their own little world, and there wasn't really a platform for sharing so instantly as we have today. There was always just places like DeviantArt and websites where you could post your work, but it was almost it was almost a formal unveiling when you post something on DeviantArt. It wasn't the moment that you throw up on Instagram that we have today. And so I think there's questions there as well. I think our visual culture is converging on the moment now, where almost it's like you're expected to create in real time something that people can consume in a moment, in an instant. And this world, I mean, again, there's something about Half-Life 2 going back, which today I can look at it and I can see it for its flaws, but I can also see that, man, it had a worldview, and in Japanese again, the word is sekaikan. It had a theme. It had basically, you could say, yep, this is Half-Life 2, and then you could go and create another piece of media, and if it checks the boxes, it can kind of slot into the Half-Life 2 universe, or the Half-Life universe in a bigger sense. And there was objects, characters, media, everything that you could imagine. It kind of fit into that world, and people picked that up and they ran with it. And that's why it inspired people like myself so deeply at the time, is it had a worldview that was nuanced and you could imagine yourself into it. Whereas today, I feel like, maybe I've been disconnected for too long. I don't know what it is, but I just don't get into worlds like I used to. And, I mean, full disclosure, I'm totally not, I don't watch television. I don't watch Netflix. If I watch a film, it's usually something from the last century. I very rarely go to cinemas anymore, mainstream cinemas. There's a few independent places that do reruns and indie films and things like that. But for the most part, I've kind of given up on the Hollywood agenda of regurgitating themes and storylines, because it just doesn't draw me into it. I can't suspend my disbelief, and my ability to, my threshold for suspending disbelief now is so much higher, having experienced what I've, having seen what I've seen and read what I've read and created what I've done. It takes a lot for me to really get into something now, and I don't think that's necessarily a negative, but it does present challenges sometimes, and I see stuff starting to look the same. I see even my own imagery starting to perhaps recreate, or to answer questions, to talk to topics which have been in the open for too long. there's already answers there. It's already been responded to. What's the new? What's the world that we are trying to create, that I'm trying to create with my images, with my work? And again, I keep finding myself going back to the history, back to literature, my own history even. Going back to that's why I'm going through this old media that I used to consume, because it had an impact on me. And that's why I read so much now. I mean, I think most people should, but I read every day, and I'm working through fiction, non-fiction, ancient literature, translations, of course, modern stuff, Japanese, French, Argentinian authors, all of this range of work, and it's inspiring me, and it's giving me an insight into worlds that were nuanced, deep, and they had something to them. They had edge, and that's kind of what I'm beginning to look for. And I think I'm at this stage. I'm kind of on this plateau right now where I have seen the world out there. I've seen the future. I saw it in Shanghai. I've seen visions of the future, what the future could have been in somewhere like Tokyo, where there's a retrofuturism that's kind of a throwback to the 1980s and 1990s, when Japan was going to be the future, but it didn't fulfill that vision. And so a lot of the architecture and just the visual, the aesthetic of the city of Tokyo is retrofuturism. Shanghai is currently, it is futurism itself. But I have all of these different ways of looking at it. And then you go to somewhere more historical. You go to somewhere like Taiwan. I've just been to Taipei City, and that's like, wow, that's what Japan looked like in the 1960s. But it's today, and there's all these old buildings. There's shrines. There's Japanese shrines to Japanese gods in Taiwan still to this day. And it's like, wow, what was that all about? You start reading into the history of it. The colonial period and how it influenced the future and the course of history. And there's all of this really fascinating stuff. And I find that so inspirational. And I'm still trying to process it, though. I'm still trying to understand, well, how can I bring this to my work? How can I create worlds that people jump into and that people fully consume? And I think I'm beginning, humbly, I think I'm beginning to do it. I'm beginning to create work, working with, even my friends, the circle of people, the creatives that I know. I create photographs, and one of my friends, he was inspired to create this piece of music to go with the image. And I realized, we're part of this creative ecosystem, and we're feeding off each other. And if you're feeding from this kind of pop, instant, Instagram, consumable, where you're taking each image, bite by bite, and you're just taking it and you're trying to unravel it, work out how it was made, and then so you can recreate that. You begin to lose a little bit of the allure of the creative process, which is experimental, not being too precise, kind of messing around basically, and now I'm able to pick up something like Cinema 4D, which I don't know anything, I kind of know how to model stuff, but when it comes to shaders and rendering and stuff like that, it's like, well, I'm still a bit of a noob. And it's like, man, global illumination, you bring that, you do some global illumination. I was like, well, yeah, that's old, we don't need that. But then you do a screenshot of it while it's still kind of halfway rendered, and you get this really cool dot pattern that the global illumination is still rendering. And it's like, wow, actually, I kind of like that. It's not even a finished product, it's not a photorealistic render. It's just a grayscale thing with these dots, but it kind of gives a cool pattern and a cool base to then jump off and try some other stuff. It's like kind of this gestalt. And that's kind of the playful creativity that I think is essential today. Not just trying to create or recreate what has come before. What people are, what your contemporaries are doing, but actually experimenting and using stuff in ways that it wasn't intended for, not being so focused on precision and being commercial and about getting your Instagram post out there. So let's not even use this software for what it was designed for. Let's actually go and use it for something else. Can we, how can we modify the camera to do this, that, and the other thing? And there's so much that I'm beginning to see potential with things like photogrammetry, creating 3D spaces from 2D images and combining those, stitching those together, and then taking those meshes and bringing them into other software and doing. There's so much stuff that you can do, and I think my next sort of phase, the next phase of my creativity is going to be experimenting more with that. Obviously with the skills I've acquired over these years, my skills, I have a commercial professional skill set which I can bring to this playful creativity. And I think that within that is this beautiful marriage of creativity, unlimited creativity, just go out there and mess around and play with it, do something. Combining that with the ability to kind of somewhat have a theme, a direction, project manage yourself, make sure it's going to get done and delivered. And I think combining those two is really critical. And you can't do that if you're basically looking at everything one for one. If you're looking at what other people are creating, their strive for photorealism and to recreate the style of influences in the industry, whether it's photography or film or motion graphics design, just go out there and mess around and see what you can come up with. Experience and feel the story behind things, the kind of the aesthetic, the transcendent, bring that into your work. And that's kind of what I'm searching for now. And it's really weird when you get to that level where you go to Shanghai City, you're sitting on the edge of this building watching out the river, the Bund, and these old buildings and the glass and the fog and all of that's coming into me directly. And I'm not simply in awe. Okay, there is obviously a huge part of it is admiration and awe and raw inspiration, but I'm also able to process it with the professional creative skill set that I now have. And that's the flow state. That's where you need to be, where you're interpreting the world, and then you're pushing out something that the world hasn't seen before. And you're basically going through, and you're this kind of sponge, and you're soaking it all up, and then you're recombining it, and you're creating something new. And that kind of innovation, that idea generation, that conceptualizing, that is where you need to be. And to do that, you need to be in the real world. I think that's really the critical thing, is you need to be moving in the real world. If your inspiration and your understanding of the world comes through and it's mediated through a device, as it used to be for me, you're always going to be reproducing what it is that you're experiencing through that device. And so when we were kids and we were modding the Source engine, we were trying to create games, we were basically trying to recreate Half-Life 2 and these games that we liked at the time, because that was what we were directly, not directly, that's what we were experiencing through the machine. But today, I'm able to go with my own eyes, under my own power, through my own ability. I'm able to go and see things that that you people wouldn't believe. Quite literally, it is incredible. And I've seen things in Tokyo. I've done projects in Hokkaido, up in these beautiful misty mountains, on pristine lakes that people never go to. I've gone to these crazy rooftops in Tokyo where I've seen the city evolve and grow from the ground up. Construction and light and sound, all of this stuff coming together, and I'm directly seeing that and directly experiencing that, and that stays with me. And so I'm able to kind of access that. I'm able to go back home. I'm able to sit down and actually, I've got this log of stuff, this huge file of stuff in my mind that I can kind of pull out and combine. And you can get really funky when you start combining stuff together and you start saying, well, yeah, I've been living in Tokyo for a while, maybe I'm getting a little bit used to it. But then you go to somewhere else that's totally different. You go to somewhere like China, which kind of has aesthetic connections with Japan. It's an Asian city. It's got the lights and the rain and the fog, just like Tokyo might have, but it's a bit different. And that difference, that kind of peels away any of the ignorance you might have grown while you had gotten used to living in Tokyo, for example. And so I go in and I'm like, yeah, this is what I need to be doing, and this is what Derive is. And it emerged. It took time to emerge, but I was like, yeah, it's wandering. It's seeing the future, the past, the contemporary world, seeing it through the process of wandering, of exploring, of taking photographs, of taking video, of converting that, not simply one for one, not simply taking a photo of what you see, but taking a photo of what it could be and what it might have been. Exploring different mediums, combining technology to create things, VR experiences, little playable worlds and demos and things that, bring in music and all this different stuff. Combine that to create the world that your imagination is conducting, okay? And so, if you've ever tried divining for water, you get two L pieces of metal, like a clothes hanger or something, and supposedly, you walk around, and when you hold it in your hands, at 90 degrees, and when the two pieces of metal cross over, supposedly it's copper wires or water or whatever, and of course that's, a bit of an old wives' tale, but what it really is it's your body subconsciously kind of moving these things, and even if you dig, I don't think you're going to find any water, but these divining rods, I think, in a sense, your mind has it with creativity. If you go out into the world, the real world, and you experience it, you travel, you see things with your own eyes, somehow or other, your mind is going to convert that into creative output. And it's especially powerful when you already have somewhat of a professional, the skill set. If you're already able to take photographs, you're already able to, use a computer, do coding or whatever it is, whatever your creative medium might be. And I think everyone has it deep down. Maybe they just don't know it. But I think all of us as human beings, we have a creative side to what we do. But going out into the real world and divining that, deriving that, and that's where the word comes from, is deriving meaning from the world, from the city, from the mountains, from the rivers, going out and seeing it and conducting aesthetic, this aesthetic exercise, and not simply just seeing what you see, but seeing what it could have been. And that's really what I think I'm beginning to understand, and I'm hoping to really explore this more. I think it's something I'm still working through myself, and I don't know if there's there's rules and there's logic to it that I'm still trying to work out. But I think really that's what Derive has become, and I think maybe I never had a word for it before. When I was younger, when I was a child, I didn't have a word for it, but I think it was always there. I was always out there wandering and wondering and exploring the world that I kind of wanted to create and that I wanted to see, and that the world and what it could have been.